Welcome to today's episode of Coffee with Chris. On with me, we have Dr. Michael Matthews, who is one of our board members at Logic Central Online, but has a background in education. And we're talking to him today about kind of the science behind learning and how children learn, mostly for what we're looking at in our Logic Central, our STEM-based high school concept that we're putting together for the XQ Super School project. Welcome, Dr. Matthews. Give us a background on yourself. Tell us about yourself real quick.
Well, firstly, Chris, I want to say thank you for allowing me to be here with you. I'm quite excited about Logic Central and the opportunities that you're providing for others to learn about themselves and the world around them. About a little bit about who I am. I have my doctorate from Marcus University, focusing on higher education, in fact. My dissertation involves attitudes towards professional development and receptivity of new information. My study was conducted in Puerto Rico, 47% of the San Juan School District number 2, in fact, because they break it down in 1 and 2. So School District 2 participated in my study, and so I found a lot of folks who have their attitudes being affected. And what I mean by attitudes, of course, is how it is that the environment formed their feelings, towards new information, and their ability, to accept new information and in its relationship to student performance. Prior to that, I got my master's degrees. I earned it rather at Central Connecticut State University in education. Interestingly, I focused my thesis on Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences. And years later, as I was working on my dissertation for my doctorate, I used one of his proteges, at least I would like to think so, in looking at attitudinal formation. So it's been a continuing learning experience with me, looking at both how students think and how students feel, ultimately how teachers think and feel as well. And so learning to me has always been about a reciprocity, that as you teach, you also learn, and as you learn, you also teach. So what goes on in the classroom really is a dynamic of human learning experiences. And all that perspective, I think, was influenced by my bachelor's degree. I majored in both anthropology and psychology. So there you go. My whole background, if you will, has really been people-centered in how that affects, the way we learn.
That is amazing background. That's kind of why we have you on, because we're looking at how and the same type of things in developing a next generation school that would link the technological era. And I like to call it the socio-technological era. The socio-technological revolution is where we're at now. We've been through the industrial, and the technological revolution is kind of, I'd say, saturated at this point, where we're picking towards the end of it. But now we're adopting society and technology, and that's what I call the socio-technological revolution is just starting, and we're in swing as to, how our ways and our things that we've been doing for centuries. And a big one of these is training our young people. We have to train them with the skills and the traits needed for the technological age, because it's not going away. And we're still looking at, I would call it, archaic education strategies and classrooms sit and lecture, when our kids are going home and watching YouTube and learning more about education in 2 hours after school than they learned all day sitting there zoning out in front of somebody, droning on, looking at a textbook, and their eyes are going crossed. So how do we put together the next generation of school that grabs their attention? So the first thing I wanted to talk about was, we did a poll on kids in high school level, which is where we're looking at putting this together, on how did they learn the best? And I kind of wanted to bounce off you. I'll read through this list of things that they say were the ways they learned best. And we're looking at how can we integrate these and others that we'll talk about into this next generation school platform. But kinesthetic learning, so hands-on, getting their fingers in something, doing something while they're watching it. So they really said, so many kids said, oh yeah, I love to watch a YouTube video and then try something. They didn't say that about the teacher in the school and the textbook open in front of them. That just None of those things from a traditional school system came up on this list. Doing things while you're hands on, getting your hands into it, given a problem to solve, and then let them ask for help was a big one. And then a big thing about self-learning and the ability to use a platform like Reddit to just go through and start reading what people have put out and then how the community valued it was a big thing that came out, is seeing the input from thousands of people on the web and social media gave them a level of relevance to what they were seeing. So that was kind of our sampling of what these high schoolers were saying, how they learn best. And we want to integrate that into a platform of, and we call it, instead of learning to work, we're going to look at working to learn, a project-based platform. So hearing this, what's your thoughts on this, Dr. Matthews?
Well, I like the fact that you're saying working to learn because it implies that you have to be involved, and being involved means how do we motivate, folks in order to be involved. One thing that we do have to take into account is the fact that, you're correct. Kinesthetic learning is something that's lifelong. One thing I would like to dispel is that, there's one type of learner or there's one way of thinking. The reality is that people, as we grow and as we change and develop, so too our worldviews and the way that we would like to participate in that world in order to make sense of it. What does this mean is that, if you were to just tell someone something, more than likely they'll just forget it. And that's what happens in the classroom, and why when you describe archaic instructing is occurring, that students, they want to go home and they want to get involved because, they just don't want to sit back and and just be lectured to. No one likes that, in fact. And rather, the way learning occurs is whether or not it makes sense and whether it's meaningful. In order to gain meaning, it has to have a purpose. So students will want to, especially this generation, they want to experience things. If they see it, they might want to do an experiment to see if it's real, if they could actually perform like what they saw on YouTube. All of that makes a lot of sense. So just to reiterate, I think that kinesthetically, we all learn. It's a lifelong process. It never stops. It doesn't just end in kindergarten or in first and second grade, where you find that a lot of the hands-on approaches seem to be, dominating. But rather we have to think, how do we involve those high schoolers? How do we motivate them? How does it make sense to them? If we just tell them something without giving an opportunity to explore or having a hands-on approach, even with basic, problem solving, then, how are we going to do that? And I think basically the research is saying that, solution-based driven skills cannot be separated from a team building environment. So you do have to have a team oriented environment. Teachers have to be facilitators. They just cannot be they just can't disseminate knowledge and sit back and expect people to be motivated. It just does not work like that. We have to motivate by getting people involved, just as you described.
So you had mentioned something that I wanted to talk about, is different people learn differently. So, in fact, we have a sampling from a certain core type of kids that are interested in STEM and have been. Do you think that if we designed a school around this type of learning style, we're missing some of the other population?
Well, I think that, we have to diversify the way that we teach. And if we have a curriculum that offers an opportunity where you can select or choose from ways to instruct, then you serve that purpose. If students are saying that they particularly like or they are motivated by a certain style of instruction, then we have to operate in that manner. It's not to say, though, that 10 or 20 years from now that style, won't change. I mean, things do change significantly, as generations also change. What we're doing now may be differently that has been done, 30 years ago. And that's obvious by the use of technology in the classrooms. So I think is justified. I'm a proponent of evidence-based instruction. So if you survey students and they say, "Look, this is how we learn best," then I think as a teacher, you should listen and you should definitely do what the students are requesting.
Okay. And yeah, interesting. Is there anything else, from your experience in polling a lot of students that, you know, in a learning environment, how learning is done best, you could suggest as far as, how the science that you find out backs up those learning styles?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. Let's say you have a classroom of 15 students, okay, which is a fantastic ratio if you, if you're a teacher in a high school classroom, and so
Mm-hmm.
you have 15 students, and you want to go and deliver or introduce a new concept. Well, that's your opportunity to actually assess whether or not that new concept is something that either A, that the students are motivated to learn about, or B, whether or not it's something that they can learn based on the type of methodology that you choose to instruct. So, that comes down to, whether or not you have the resources available to diversify that you instruct. So, you do have to take a look at the different learning styles or different ways of multiple intelligences, if you will, or even if just, to assess an individual and see, wow, this kid may learn they may be a visual learner in this particular topic, but when it comes to another, they're totally auditory or they're totally, kinesthetic or whatever have you. It's just that certain subjects would require a different methodology,
Mm-hmm.
and it's organic, as we grow and as we change, so too our relationship to others and the world around us. So we have to, as experts in the classroom, assess. We constantly are using informal assessments through critical questions, of critically questioning our students. We want to find out why they respond a certain way. Whether or not they think it's relevant, how can we change the topic or even change the way that we teach, to make things more relevant. I hope
Mm-hmm.
that answered your question.
Yeah, you said something I wanted to build on is the motivation piece,
Yes,
motivating
okay.
them, and a lot of that has to do with the learning environment.
Uh-huh.
And we also polled kids about what learning environment they enjoyed, and so many of the themed questions came back around they're focusing on when they were more active, their biorhythms, when they're able to learn,
Hmm. Yes.
how they need to break up different subjects and topics and having
Hmm.
breaks in between. And so, what do you recommend as far as your research on learning environments? How would we design in an environment that made more sense for one? Some of the comments they had was getting up too early. A lot of kids,
Hmm.
their
Hmm.
brain wasn't clicking earlier in the day,
Hmm.
and then some of them would say that the school didn't divide up their really
Hmm.
hard core subjects with
Hmm.
breaks, with more hands-on kinesthetic art classes or
Hmm.
whatever, and some of them would have like all their core classes in one day, and then the next day really light classes, or
Hmm.
just not broken up in a way that made sense to them. So that type of
Hmm.
environment and mapping to their biorhythms, what kind of
Hmm.
a recommendation would you give for that type of thing?
Well, that's quite an interesting point. It's legitimate. A lot of brain research says that you have certain times of the day, where you're more receptive, to certain types of thinking, and as a result, certain types of subjects. For example,
Mm-hmm.
mathematic, logical type of topics should relative, of course, it's all relative, but generally speaking should be taught during the day, during the morning hours.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have more of, because people tend to kind of get a little tired, particularly if you have a growing adolescent. We should be mindful of that. So you might want to do something that's more social studies related, where they can interact a little bit more and start engaging in discussions. So discussion led activities, a lot of facilitation of new ideas, and all of that really is aligned with our biorhythms, because even even myself, to come towards the end of the evening around 10 o'clock,
Mm-hmm.
11 o'clock at night. Yeah, don't ask me a mathematical equation. I can't solve it for you. My mind is not even there.
Mm-hmm.
My mind is in reflective mode. I'm thinking about how I learned throughout the day and my new experiences. I mean, maybe even planning for the next day. So my mind is in tune with my body.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to take that into account, definitely. But the other point that you have about breaking up the subject matter, there has been other studies done where cognitively speaking, we're more holistic, in the way that we approach things. So if you were to teach one particular subject that's disassociated with another, and particularly if it's not at the right time of day or it's just not done correctly, the students don't bridge that connection. Then it's too foreign for them. It's
Mm-hmm.
like you have a puzzle piece in your mind, but the pieces are just not connecting because
Mm-hmm.
the whole picture doesn't make sense. And that's what we do anyway. We want to make sense of things. I know Gestalt, and when you look at Gestalt psychology, if you were to look at a uh, random dots or something on the ceiling, and you're staring, kind of like the popcorn a painting, a popcorn paint, you
Mm-hmm.
know, it, yeah. So you're staring at this. Eventually, you're going to form some patterns. Ancient people knew this when they looked at the stars at night and they saw patterns.
Mm-hmm.
So we know this intrinsically that if it doesn't make sense, kids will be disengaged.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to learn more about it. They're going to be like discouraged because they can't make those bridges or those gaps. Just cannot make any sense. Because there's nothing to connect between one subject to another. So definitely you got to look at biorhythms, and for sure you have to see whether or not there's a continuation of thought. You have to have a theme to connect all those topics together. It makes more relevancy, to the student's mind.
Yeah, and I think what we're looking at for our theme is everything is technological error. So from one class to another, the theme that would always kind of stick together is that we're looking at what is in the future, what is in the now that we can link together with technology.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Yes.
and also, one of the things as you were talking, I know I have written about quite a bit is that throughout the week, we're looking at biorhythms through the day. People are relatively similar, but throughout the week, people engage more in different types of activities at different
Mm-hmm.
times from their break. Basically, if you look at the weekend as they had some time off, their mind was able to relax. Back to work Monday, Tuesday, and half of the day Wednesday. I always say those are my focus times, and then I'll
Mm-hmm.
shift into social things, Wednesday and later in the week. So actually,
Mm-hmm.
by designing your week to hit it and take kind of your opposition to your breaks when they're
Mm-hmm.
refreshed, hit it hard, and then stem through the week back into the schedule, the cycle of. I always look at your logical, rational early in the week, early in the morning, moving towards midday into social, end of the week social, and then more physical toward the end of the day and the end of the week. So those kind
Mm-hmm.
of three things pulling together, and that was a theme we'll look at also as far as the development of the school program.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that it also makes sense as well. And one thing to keep in mind is that when we develop the routine should equal into a habit. We definitely don't want to form habits where we break up kids with their schedule, and it doesn't make sense to them because really you don't want to make people to be disconnected. And we
Mm-hmm.
see that sometimes in conversations with adolescents, and you may ask them about a certain subject, and they may trail off their thinking into a whole different subject altogether. And we say,
Mm-hmm.
well, that's unrelated. It's like, how did you get from one subject to the next? And generally, it's just that's the way that they were taught. They weren't
Mm-hmm.
taught to have really solid connections, and
Interesting.
you know, and and if we say to our students, look, here we have a program that that in the beginning of the week it's more socially inclined, and the topics are going to make sense because it's working with the way that they're being introduced into this week. it makes more sense than to just say, okay, we're going to do it this way and then stop, and then the next way and then stop, and then this way and then stop.
Hmm.
Touch and go is never going to be effective compared to, looking at things more holistically, and making it aligned, with the current research, as we're saying, makes a whole lot more sense in terms of looking at a new way of doing education.
Yeah. So you touched on something there that I think fits into one of the other comments we heard a lot. And this is that the current school system focuses on almost the lowest common denominator of the bell curve. If you're looking at the bell curve, where's the middle of
Hmm.
the average kids at? And they kind of have to do this because of, they just bring in everybody. So how, and most of the kids, especially the ones that we polled that were very STEM related, science, technology, and they were, a lot of these kids later in high school were very, already had determined what they were doing in their career, accepted in college, things like that.
Hmm.
But they had such a problem with the way that the teaching was all geared towards kind of the lowest common denominator in the classroom. How can we strive to make that? I mean, other than, obviously we're looking at a school type of design that is for people to opt into, that self kind of polarize themselves to they want this. But if we wanted to adopt a more progressive school system,
Hmm.
this bell curve mentality and teaching to the lowest common denominator almost
Hmm.
seems to be a tie up. How would you recommend about in that, working with that limitation, I guess?
Yeah, what you describe, it unfortunately is really what goes on in the classroom. From my years of teaching, and I've taught elementary, I've taught high school, I've been a college professor, and it seems to be that the same thing where you have those few individuals who they just don't get it, and they would require more teaching time. And well, what are you going to do with the rest of the class, who they do get it and it's time for them to move on? How do you integrate them, if you will, into that lesson so that they are being challenged, to learn new things and to build new connections? I think that if you have the resources available, and if you diversify your instruction, you can simplify that by saying, there's more than one way to look at the same subject. There's more than one way to get you involved, to get yourself involved, in the same topic. And as I would advise a faculty member in higher education, is that when you come to that point where you may have half the students, learning a little bit quicker, and then the other half, still kind of, being lackadaisical, for lack of a better word. Okay, then inspire them, you know do something different, teach a different way, but the same subject.
Mm-hmm.
you know Use different ways of methodologies, but again, you're sticking with the topic. That way you can engage the learner to think differently. And 9 out of 10 times, it's not that they don't get it, it's that they haven't found a new way of looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't found yet, that connection to the topic so that it makes sense to them. Until you can find that connection, whether it's going to be something that you have to reteach, a skill set, or whether you're going to have to reteach a concept but in a different way, then that bell curve will always exist, where you have a few that's going to be down in one end and another one's going to be in the other spectrum. You're going to have a vast majority in the middle, and then of course you go into all other controversies, such as looking at socioeconomics, a big factor into that bell curve. Maybe students did not receive, the right, number of resources in the school system prior to being enrolled, and so on and so forth. So,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not a real fan of the bell curve. I think unfortunately, it may exist, but it only exists in light of how you teach and the kind of evaluations you put in place, and whether or not you strongly believe that there's only one way of teaching and one way of learning.
Yeah. Interesting you said that the passion behind finding a way to teach it was also another thing that came up really rather often with the kids was, their teachers either don't know a particular topic, especially you get into the advanced topics, or
Hmm.
they're not really passionate about it. So I mean, we
Hmm.
looked at a school design, and we're looking at crossing industry expertise. So a lot of this is that you have a great percentage of teachers who are liberal arts background, have kind of the same knowledge set, because literally if they were to have the same degree in technology or in a STEM related field, they're making 2 or 3 times as much at a corporation. So they're not teaching, and this is the dilemma we're facing. So we look at, in the next generation education system, if we have a platform where we can pull experts and resources, and we're actually looking at linking this to industry efforts, that, for an hour, you get an expert on microbiology to, even if it's a pre-recorded video or, or webcast or something where they, somebody can, the kids, the students can say, wow, this guy can understand this, can show the passion. He's built his whole life around it. Now we understand, now we get it. But pulling in those resources as part of this effort is what we're kind of looking at doing. What do you think about a platform that would do that, that kind of, because another big problem we heard from the teachers actually was, it takes so long to get certified to be a teacher. You can't just bring in an expert for a couple of minutes or for a couple of classes, because they'd have to spend a couple years to get all their certs done, and then they, the background check, and a lot of them don't even want to bother with that type of thing, Anyway, you get to the point where, can we do this virtually, polling experts all over the world in their respective topics and industries, to borrow them for an hour?
I think that's a really good way of thinking about that. That is, thinking about the solution and how do you motivate students who are complaining that here they are in a classroom and they're asking real questions, and the teacher cannot answer them because they lack content. The content knowledge is lacking. Okay. When a teacher goes for certification, yes, there is an assessment of whether there's content knowledge, but it may or may not be at the expert level, So what we have to do is that either we have to train our teachers more efficiently, give them more professional development, or we bring in the experts, and we say, okay, you're an expert, now teach. But here's the dilemma with that. How do we teach? We can be an expert in our own right, but really fail when it comes to delivery of that content and that knowledge, and then the reverse effect happens where then, there's a disillusionment in that classroom. It's like, wow, here we have somebody who has all this knowledge, but, we just don't understand anything, So, there has to be this marriage, if you will, between the person who knows about the subject and then a person who knows how to teach the subject, So developing yes, you definitely want to develop a program where you have people with content knowledge, but then you also have to have a program that puts methodologies in place and say, look, okay, here's how to do it. Here are the resources. When you have students who are lacking, that ability to connect well with the subject, it's not that you yourself, because you're an expert, that you can't relay the information. It's just, how do you relay that information? Which methods are in place? That's why you find teachers that are very adamant about, how to teach. If you talk to a teacher after 20 years, they've developed a certain practice in their own right, and they feel like basically they can teach anything. And why is that the case? Is because they've mastered how to teach, not necessarily content, but or there may be some content teachers out there who mastered how to teach, and those are really the best ones, So I think that would answer that question.
Yeah, that is interesting, and something that will have to put some thought into. That even if we bring in industry experts, we got to find out a way to unify the platform so that they're training in a manner which, like you said, doesn't bore the kids to death and say, I'll never look at that subject again, because why would I want to touch that if it's that boring, type of thing, But definitely a good point there you have. Kind of another thing the kids had brought up quite a bit was extracurricular activities. So many kids said that homework was too intensive. And I know this from watching my own son. He has all this homework assigned, and yet he's learning all night long by watching a science video or a semiconductor video on YouTube, or he's reading some science. He's really interested in science, but yet sometimes he doesn't get his homework done, and he gets a bad grade on homework, and the way they're judging him is this kid's not learning, he's not up to par. But I know for a fact that he understands the theory of black holes and particle accelerators and relativity, and he would spend all night doing that, but yet the class, the homework he's assigned is not drawing his interest. And he learned that topic, like we were talking about the bell curve earlier, when they talked about it for 2 minutes in class, and then the rest of the class they spent going over the same thing for the lowest common denominator, and he's totally disengaged by the time he's done with that. And then he has homework on top of that, for doing the same thing for literally hours. A lot of times it looks like. But yet a way to say how can we, and this is what we're looking at for the school, design in a platform that measures the child's engagement in the topics they're interested in, to show their overall commitment to education instead of just how they're performing on the assigned topics. What's your thoughts on that?
I think that teachers do have to engage their students wisely. It's not just about the end result. In particularly the amount and the type of homework. There's a lot of difference of opinions out there. I prefer to think that you want to make it so that students feel that it's meaningful, that it's definitely going to be worth it, that when they return to school with this assignment, that it's going to be looked at. Those are some major components as well there. The other thing is how much of the time that is spent on this homework, and the value of that time being spent. So, we can look at an assignment and say, okay, as a teacher, whether or not this is going to be effective based on, when the students come back, if I'm able to engage a student, with this assignment. But more so than not, you want to make it so that it's relevant and meaningful. I would particularly like to see that students are using their time that is more of in a virtual way, so that if they are researching an assignment, then they come back and able to report it, that they're able to actually conduct an experiment, project-based learning. It doesn't have to be that there's just an assignment per night. It could be, look, here's an assignment, it's due by a certain date. Here's a rubric. Here's all the things that are aligned for that. This is what that we're measuring, and which is the other thing I was talking about earlier, Chris, and that's the evaluation piece of it. Students really should not be evaluated on things that they don't know ahead of time, that would be worth. So, if you have a project, students have to know, what are the points, if there are points assigned to it, what are the criteria involved, so that way they can really do a good job. There should not be a guessing game, whether it's going to be in the classroom or with a home assignment. Students really should know what is expected of them. The same thing in the workplace. If someone is hired and there's a metrics involved, okay, well, how are we going to get our performance evaluated? So you find that there's a real world connection when we do use those basic strategies in the classroom with both homework assignments and classroom assignments. Students should know what's expected of them and should be able to be measured on those expectations.
What do you think about, literally, even the students that, this came from the students that were the most motivated, that were, accepted to college early on in their senior year, had a life plan designed and said, we got too much homework. What do you say to that?
Do you mean that they had too much homework and so they lacked the motivation because of that?
That they just felt that they were assigned too much homework and they didn't balance it with, and I guess a lot, some of the comments were more in line of, you have 7 teachers or 8 teachers that are teaching us, and they all assign homework at the same time, and then there's stretches where there's nothing, and just the overall amount of homework assigned was either not coordinated well or just overdone, just busy work. And they're looking at it as, what is it that we're getting out of value if they just take all of our life away after school? After 8 hours at school, we spend 4 hours a night and we're tired all the time. What value does that have?
I agree with them 100%. What value does it have? Yeah, and you did you actually you found out one of the problems there, and that's lack of coordination. When I've conducted my study, one of the attitudes that was an attitude doesn't necessarily mean that it's negative or positive. Okay, it's
Mm-hmm.
just an experience that teachers go through that gives them a certain feeling about how to conduct themselves as professionals, either with their peers or with their administration or even with their own students. So with that being said, if you have teachers who lack coordination with others, chances are they may have an attitude that has formed against the fact that coordination is going to end in some sort of positive impact on student achievement. And why is that the case? Because they don't want to be criticized for their teaching. They may also feel that, in comparison to other teachers, what they're doing may be a little bit either more advanced or less advanced. So there's a lack of coordination there for a lot of reasons, but that seems to be a predominant reason.
Mm-hmm.
When we're taking into the account of whether students feel motivated or not because they think that it's overwhelming with the amount of homework that they receive, then we do have to sit back and ask, is it important to assign homework?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really up in the policy with the fact that really it's not all that important to assign homework. I think what's more important is that you give assignments that are worth the time and the effort that students put into it, and how that's demonstrated is by their willingness to actually get it done, you know. And so, if you have a project-based assignment, for instance, as a teacher, you have to reach out to other teachers and ask what's being done in with the other subjects, before we assign such a project. But nonetheless, it should be motivating. You should assess the students whether or not they're ready to receive such an assignment, and if they're not, then just simply don't assign it.
Yeah.
Keep on working in the classroom until you discover through interacting and through assessing your students the proper type of homework assignment to give them.
Yeah. Or the proper amount seemed to
Or the
be
proper
the
amount.
theme that I
Yes.
was hearing. Okay, but what is the science behind how much homework is assigned and why?
Well, back in the 90s, Storrs, Connecticut, UConn, University of Connecticut, they came up with a program called Upward Bound. And then they also came up with another thing called Step Up as well. And, what I like about these programs is that they look at homework as far as family engagement. And if the school is involving the parents, and through the parent engagement, they found out that homework really must be constructive. But if it interferes with time spent in the family, or if it interferes with the natural development of the student, then it goes against what the school would like to do, which is to create a student body who's actively engaged in their education.
Yeah.
So there isn't a real science necessarily behind assigning homework. I think it's more cultural based than anything. If you work in a private school, for instance, and the expectation is that there has to be homework assignments, then chances are, the child would receive a lot of homework because the client base, which is the parents who are paying for the education, will require it. You
Yeah.
know, so what do you do as an administrator? Well, you have to listen to what the client says, and more than likely, the child will suffer.
Huh.
That's just the reality of it. If you're dealing in a public institution, there may be some leeway there, and you can say, well, you know what, at this point, it doesn't make sense, to have a child, or an adolescent spend more than an hour, 30 minutes to an hour worth of studying time at home,
Yeah.
you know, regardless of what the cultural background of that family may say. It's more sound advice to say that, there shouldn't be too much time spent. Rather, there should be other things spent, like sport activity, club activities, You want the students to get out there. You want children to develop into healthy citizens. So, what type of programs, if they watch TV, are you monitoring at home?
Hmm.
Things of that sort, to make more of a holistic approach, to learning, rather than just saying that homework has to be an extension of the classroom. I don't believe in that. I don't think that's true necessarily.
Yeah. So, and I would have to say that, between like myself and my son, homework is actually, if we're talking about homework being something that's engaging the parents, homework is often driving a wedge between us at home, because I am trying to monitor and make sure he's getting it all started, getting it all done, and he's taken so much time that now I'm the hammer. I'm just always driving him, and it's
Mhm.
just not a conducive to beneficial relationship. But yet, if that doesn't happen, he's not going to get the grades at school. So it just seems
Mhm.
like it's always a detrimental to the home life balance, at least in my house.
Yeah, but then you also have families too who may say, well, there's not enough homework, and so then the child, or the adolescent, or they suffer, because now the parent is assigning homework, and it may not even be relevant, and even more dangerous. It could be interfering with their cognitive development, because now there's that conflict by what the teacher is saying. So the teacher may be teaching one way on how to problem solve a mathematical equation, but yet
Hmm.
the parent may have learned an alternative way to solve that same problem, and so now you have a conflict at home, you know, caused by too little homework. So,
Now I'm curious. You just strike my interest here.
uh-huh.
Where do these people come from that are giving their kids more homework than the school has? Where do you
Well,
see
this
that?
this is my experience from working and consulting in private schools. That's a big issue. You do have teachers, who receive complaints from parents that there's not enough homework. And so therefore there has to be a curriculum for homework assignments, and what it comes down to sometimes is having to photocopy things, or having to even in terms of technology, what internet-based, type of assignments that has to be done. That does happen.
Hmm.
That does. I think what it comes down to is the policy in the school, whether the administration has, a kind of team that involves the parents, and keeping them informed, and also communicating with them about what school policy is. And if you have a school that has the policy in place that's already articulated and communicated with the parents, then that should really, demystify, if you will, of what homework should be, and as long as it makes sense to the parents, then you find that support there, and making sure that the students also make sense of it as well.
So that's interesting that it's really the parents, and I had not heard this before. So this is a good driver for what we're doing here. That
Hmm.
maybe there's, and this is just thinking off the cuff, maybe on the parent portal, there's a little slider for each class that says, tell us if you're too much, not enough homework, and how we meet the needs of the kid for this class.
Hmm. I think actually that's a must. Particularly if we want to have success at school, then we should have a successful household
Hmm.
with supporting the academic performance. When No Child Left Behind Act rolled out again in the 90s, and we're still seeing the repercussions of that, there was a big gap, a big cultural gap even.
Hmm.
You mentioned the bell curve earlier. Well, I mean that was a bell curve at its best. And why was that the case? Was there was no training in what homework looked like, for the parents.
Hmm.
And what I needed to do as a vice principal at that time was to put together a library of literature for what No Child Left Behind Act was all about. I had to let the parents know that what we're looking is to um, you know, uh, bridge that gap between low academic performers and the high-ended performers who seem to be testing very well on standardized tests. So the question of why really came out to how, do we engage the parents? Not necessarily why are the kids performing this way, but more so, how do we get the parents involved so that we can have that relationship, with them understanding that when it comes to studying for tests or completing homework assignments, there's relevancy,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and there's meaning behind that, and it just can't be, and here comes the training of the teachers component. It just can't be just a random homework assignment. It has to be linked to a certain standard, and it has to be linked to an expectation, because when it comes to the testing component, the students are performing at a level that can easily be attributed to how well how well they learned based on teacher performance, how well also the family structure was in terms of supporting that student for academic success.
Interesting. Yeah, well, that's some great insight on that topic. Yeah, and earlier we talked about the relevance, bringing things together. The kids, not being able to just transition from one thought to another because the class is entirely different, the teacher's entirely different. Our concept here in putting this school together is to focus every class, every topic around modern era technological needs. So what are they going to be, no matter whether they're a doctor, a lawyer, a garbage man, or an engineer? All those facets of life now are involving technology. And if you're not up on the social media and advertising and being out there, even as a garbage company, there's competition that's going to eat your lunch. So you're relevant in every area. So we're looking at, and just wanted your thoughts on this. If we look at teaching all our classes, so social studies, interact with people across the world, health, maybe even a digital based fitness as watches to wear to understand and track and monitor it as you're learning. In English, to do more focus on web content and production in the modern era of how you set yourself up in self branding. In geography and physics, online resources and approaching people from other places in the world and matching them up with a type of pen-pal relationships. And then if we went to history, what is the history and the relevance of technology and how has it affected the outcome of each stage and era type of thing? Well, we could go right down the line of basically pulling together all the courses to have a common theme, which is what is needed for the next era of our human existence. What's your thoughts on that for our curriculum base?
Well, having a thematic based curriculum is outstanding, and why is that? Is because you want the students to be able to make the links. It has to make sense for them. I mean, that's what we do anyway as human beings. If it doesn't make sense, we feel uncomfortable, and we don't learn. Okay, we kind of shut off, if you will, that learning ability because it just doesn't make sense to us. Or if it doesn't make sense, we try and try again so that it kind of does make some sort of relevancy. So saying to the students, this is modern era theme, and we're going to bring in content level experts. Right away, that's a piqued interest. It's going to make sense. And what you're doing is that you're setting up the expectation for both the teacher and for the student to expect that this is going to make sense as well. Okay, because I mean, what better avenue than to say, what, here's your education. It's going to serve the purpose in today's times. It's not learning for nothing. It's like learning history, but I mean, what good is it if we don't learn from it? So it has to make sense in today's time in some way. It just can't be learning for the sake of knowledge. I mean, knowledge serves a purpose. Either it's going to be answering the question of who we are, why we exist, what's our profession, what's our calling in life, and all those major questions, if you will, comes from the basic approach, and that's finding relevancy in the here and now, in the present tense. Why are you here? Why is this important to you? Why do we have to learn this? And bringing in the content of knowledge experts is going to make that ever more interesting.
Yeah, I definitely hope that this is something that I would love to see that my son involved with, and in some ways we have him involved with a extracurricular robotics club, and actually run this robotics class like a company. They have a CEO and vice presidents of each department for software and design and mechanical design, and then electronics design and the but anyway, they look at it from how do we map this to exactly what they're going to need when they get out of here, which is kind of our whole topic or theory of the work to learn instead of learn to work. So that's kind of our focus here. And one big topic, and the last thing I kind of want to bring up is, and this is from my own life, and we talked about this before, and what I've seen in the relevance of people that I have been hired over the years, is that in our country, we'll say in the last 20 years or so, I'm not sure before that, but that's when I was monitoring this kind of system of education, that our focus has been so much in, we'll say, almost a liberal arts focus, where I know as an employer, I was hiring people looking for skills in STEM because I worked in technology, cryptology, cybersecurity, looking for people who were competent in those areas. I had to go outside the United States because 90% of the people that I needed, I could not find the skills. And I thought, okay, they're just not finding us. They're not applying. We're finding these people from overseas. But then I had these employees that worked for me, and both from the United States and from overseas. And the ones from overseas had an entirely different story about their background and their upbringing. And I related this to my son's experience, where they would, people from overseas would say, wow, I studied my whole life, and everybody looked at me like I was the best thing in the society because I was learning engineering and math and science type of technologies. But over here, if you're not a sports star, if you're a geek, if you're in school and you're studying, it's like a socially unaccepted thing. And it seems to start at the teaching level and the curriculum and what they're doing. Because I was telling you earlier, my son went through up to about second or third grade, and they said, oh, he has autistic tendencies. They put him in special classes. Everybody helicoptered around him, and he disengaged. What were they trying to do? They were trying to teach him soft skills, they called it. But it was really, he got the impression at that young age, when they're impressionable, that he wasn't supposed to be like he was. He wasn't supposed to be a science and math person, because everything they're trying to teach him to do is opposite of that. So in fourth grade, he disengaged, went to a school for acting, and totally, by eighth, ninth grade, he has been so far behind in math and science that we're putting him through summer school to get him caught up to be able to go into high school. And the kid loves stuff. He will sit and watch physics and math and fluid flow transfer podcasts and videos on YouTube all day long, and just suck it up. But yet the school system at that early age taught him that was wrong, and he disengaged.
Yeah. I mean, that experience of having, I'm talking, of course, from his experience of having to receive a conflicting kind of information that, yes, I mean, certainly mathematics and science is important, but it's not emphasized because, you really should be one as opposed to the other, is wrong. I mean, you really, you want to create a well-balanced individual, someone who is able to explore their strengths. And, we're given strengths for a reason. We all have a purpose in life. We all have a profession that we have to eventually fulfill, and to be meaningful and contributing members of our society. If we're producing or mass producing, if you will, people like as if, they're part of some industry, and we're saying, no, you have to be this way as opposed to what your natural inclinations tell you, then of course you're going to have a lot of what we say cognitive dissonance. You're not going to be sure of where you fit in, or even whether, or lack the confidence that what you're doing is even correct, So, and that's really not a great experience. I think that if we look and compare ourselves internationally in a global sense, yes, STEM is popular, and why it's popular, it's for what I just said. Generally countries want to have people who are productive, who are contributing members of their society, who's functioning, who's able to create, design, and to build upon their society. It's like what John F. Kennedy said. You're not going to ask what your country could do for you, but what you can do for your country. And if today's times is calling for people who are able to think mathematically, logically, who's able to be problem solvers, you can be creative and be a scientist.
Absolutely.
You can be an actor and be a mathematician. You don't have to say one or the other. But definitely, if we're going to compete in today's world economy, we have to look at what other countries are doing. And we have to say to ourselves, if we want our country, to outperform other countries, then what is it that we have to do? I mean, how is it we're going to have to work to learn, in order to make this country better? And of course, what I mean by that is how we're going to teach, in order to have our students more motivated so they can be contributing members of our society.
Yeah. And I feel that we have to empower them to know that those traits, to use for lack of a better term, are cool, because we're teaching them right now, and from the academia level, from the teacher level, that those traits aren't cool. Go be something cool, and we'll smile at you. We'll say good job. We'll give you a pat on the back whenever you're an actor and you feel like you're expressing yourselves, because that's what the education system is about. We need to change that.
Well, too, Chris, that comes up to another point too. I think there's generational differences. When we're looking at how to approach our students. If we're looking at negatively, if you will, that if you are logically minded, then you really don't fit into to what is considered to be cool, then that's totally wrong. Okay, I think that in terms of as an adult, we have to relate to our children that even in terms of technology, okay, it's not just about acting and dancing and being cool in sports, etc. Technology is not just for entertainment. It's also for world news, world events. It's for interacting. Our students understand that quite well, and they're socially inclined more so than ever. People want to share information. In fact, it's quite opposite. If you don't share information, people are now looking at you like, hey, what's wrong? What do you mean you don't have Facebook? There's something wrong with you, right? So we have to say that in terms of social skills and development here, it's not so much anymore that we're looking at physical actions or traits, where if you're athletic, then that's the great thing. But rather, how do you apply your athleticism in terms of team building and team network in other areas too? That requires problem solving. That requires mathematical concepts too. It's not that anymore where you have to isolate, someone. I think people are now multifaceted, more so than ever. People have more, access to information more so than ever. And it's not all about entertainment. That's really the point here when we're teaching our children the use of technology, when we're teaching them that it's okay to have your differences. It's, you have to be aware of that as an instructor and diversify the way that you teach.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for joining today. Tons of information from you. You are a wealth of knowledge here. And I appreciate you coming on and talking to me today. And I will keep you posted on how things are progressing with the Super School project. But thanks again for joining me today on my podcast here.
Okay. Well, thank you too, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
Yes. And everybody, please check out also LogicCentralOnline.com and our Logic Central Academy at logiccentral.org, where a lot of the work is kind of coming through for the Super School project. And if you want to get involved, reach out to us and let us know, and we'll plug you in where we can. But thanks a lot, and have a great day.